It started out with an idea to make a documentary.
Now, with over 60 interviews completed and more to record, it's time to listen fully.
These are the stories from those who experienced the Young Religious Unitarian Universalist program.
All right. So if you could just do me a favor and just state your name, and then um, can you give me sort of a, a quick rundown of where you experienced youth programming, where and what timing we're talking about, just to get us started.
Okay. So my name's Lisa Feldstein, and I had a sort of circuitous route into all of this. I'm actually Jewish. I never identified as Unitarian Universalist. But the B'nai B'rith Youth Organization was kind of awful. It was mostly making sure you married someone who was Jewish. And, at 15, that was not especially interesting to me. I had my two closest friends growing up were UU, and they were going to Switzerland for a conference of the International Religious Fellowship. And I went with them and had a great time. And so when I came back, and LRY, Liberal Religious Youth, was a member group of IRF, which was sort of the youth arm of the International Association for Religious Freedom. Can I can talk in initials, but I don't know how much people know about all of this. So anyway, I started going to local meetings at Community Church in New York and got very involved and ended up on the Metro New York LRY board about, I don't know, 9 months later, maybe. And then it was I finished high school really early. I hated high school. I figured out how to get out early, and I wasn't exactly sure what I was going to do with myself. I hadn't applied to start college, and I wanted some time off. And there was this position opening up. I was my district rep to LRY boards. And in fact, I got woken up by the current LRY execs, two of the tacos, who wondered if I would be interested in running for one of the seats uh, because they weren't excited about who else was running. And I said, sure, if you'll let me go back to sleep. And that's how I ended up moving to Taco Villa at the age of 16. I didn't even stick around for graduation. It was January. I'd finished a year and a half early. My dad put my futon in a sleeping bag and drove me to Boston, and that was that. So that's how I ended up getting involved.
That's amazing. Can you paint a picture about what the living facilities were like, and where it was, and just that whole idea of kind of working and living and close with your peers, and then how old are you at this point, and all that? Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so it is January 1981. I will be turning 17, sorry, in about half a year. So I'm 16 and a half, and we are, one of the things about Taco Villa, which is where the tacos lived, is that it tended to move a lot. And so for the first half of my term, we were in Dorchester in Fields Corner in an apartment that was a typical three-decker in Boston. We had the second story. And so each of us, there were four of us, and plus an intern every month. And so we each had our own room, and there was sort of an enclosed porch for the intern, and a constant just like moving feast of LRYers who were coming through town or who were friends or who didn't really have a place to live and were just sort of camping out on the couch for a while. The apartment was big and really comfortable. At that point, at the board meeting where I was elected, one of the things that the tacos had put on the agenda was to have an increase in their food budget, which at the time was $10 a week and per person, and they got $15 a week. So that was new and interesting for me. I been living with my parents. You open the refrigerator, there's food, right? Um, it wasn't such a thing you really had to think through and making sure there was going to be enough at the end of the week. And so that was actually really part of that experience that in some ways I remember best was dealing with that. We bought everything together because it was just, it made more sense that way. And we belonged to the food co-op in Cambridge. And so once a week we would go to Cambridge to shop at the food co-op. And it was often noisier than I wanted. I mean, there were really a lot of people around. And at the time, I was serving with Nan Warshaw, she was in the second half of her term. And Julie Farman was there, and she was wrapping up. And the person I was replacing had left halfway through their term. So I actually served for 1.5 terms instead of just one. And then the other person who was elected at the same time that I was Catherine Price. And the person whose name I couldn't think of was Amy. So it was all women. And Catherine wasn't as young as I was, but had had a really unusual upbringing. Um, and I remember her mother bringing her, and we all used stolen milk crates for furniture at the time. That was what you did in the 70s and 80s. And so we were getting ready to go across the street to the supermarket to steal some milk crates. And her mother just thought this was the greatest thing and was all dressed in black and had a watch cap on. And she was just so excited. uh, that. So we all got, other than the money for food, we each got $65 a month as a stipend and a tea pass, which I don't know how much those cost anymore or what they did at the time. And that was our compensation. I came from a family that was less financially well positioned than the others. And my parents did send me, I think, $50 a month extra, so which really was often the difference between being able to function and not. Uh, but the other tacos had, I think, a little more disposable income than I did. But it didn't really matter. We would buy clothes at this clothes by the pound place over by MIT. And I had this dress I loved that was silver and gold lace, and it was horribly uncomfortable, but it was really cool. So we would just, we would buy clothes by the pound, and we ate a lot of tahini is what I remember. Lots and lots of tahini. And shortly after I moved in, there was a Grateful Dead concert that a bunch of us had tickets to, and we held a lasagna party. And so we had all this lasagna. We made pans and pans of lasagna, and then we all left to go see the Grateful Dead. So that was sort of my introduction to living on my own.
I used to go with my friends who grew up in Wire UU to a buck a pound in Cambridge as well.
Oh, you
So,
did?
yes.
Oh
So I got all excited
my
knowing that
gosh.
LRYers were there too years ago.
I saw you kind of lit up, and it's like, oh, wow.
I got
I missed
a
that.
sweater for 20 cents and I was like, yes.
Yes, it was the best deal, and there was so much cool
Awesome.
stuff.
Awesome. Oh, that's so great.
Hi everyone, it's Lindsay. I wanted to jump in here to tell you that we are having a con-inspired connective retreat November 20th to the 22nd on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. This is co-directed by myself and Reverend Jason Leiden, with our weekend musician Matt Meyer. Many of the people you will hear on this podcast plan to be in attendance and even help lead some of the activities. Our registration is now open with a special early bird price. When you head to our website, yruu.org, click on Connective Retreat. It's time to connect. See you there.
What I think is really interesting is the separation at the time between LRY and the UUA, right?
Yes.
And how the money was not, but can you talk about like where was this money coming from that was paying you, and how did, how did you all work together to sustain this group? Yeah.
Really good questions. There was an endowment, and I, back whenever 45 years ago, I remember the name that was attached to the endowment, but that was where most of the money came from. We did get some money every year from the UUA, but not a lot. It was, a minor part of our budget. And we had office space behind the UUA. In one, there are three little buildings, three little former houses. Um, One of them is Skinner House, which was a publishing house, and we were in the one that was at the end of that little dead end. So we had office space from the UUA. We shared the building with the Church of the Larger Fellowship. And it was really just us in there. That changed as the UUA grew, other offices came in there, but not while LRY was there. So we had our own money that we were responsible for managing. We had access to what was called the Watts line, which was a discounted corporate phone line that the UUA had, and we would just, pay them for our use. Um, we put out People Soup, um, and which was our newspaper. And I don't think we paid rent. I was not the money person. Amy Shapiro was the money person. Um, I was more programs and policy. And so I was the one that did a lot of traveling to local groups and tried to get them more engaged in the national scene. This was a really difficult time for LRY. There had been for years before I ever got involved, this increasing dislike of LRY by the grown-ups who felt that we needed to be reined in, that it was just drug, sex, rock and roll. And it was those things, but there was a lot more as well. And the UUA was sort of fed up. And so Wayne Arneson had recently been hired as kind of he was not part of our staff. We were still independent, but Wayne was there to either to bring us back into the fold as what became YRUU, or to at least mediate between these two parties. Wayne had been an LRY exec. He had a history in LRY, but he also understood what the problems were. And so we ended up having a good relationship with Wayne. But there are still, I know, so many people who think that Wayne personally was responsible for destroying LRY, which he was not.
Yes, we luckily got to speak with Wayne and have a whole interview with Wayne, and yeah, yeah. It's as I learned a lot through this whole project, that people remember and deeply remember what happened to them as youth, right? And they just can tap into those feelings, and how, and just, yeah, and can just get right there. And so even people to this day could go up, to Wayne and say something to him, just, you're right.
It's true.
Yeah.
I've had arguments with so many people who think that, Wayne was, it's like, I don't know, showed up with a nuclear bomb or something and destroyed LRY. And, I was there at the time, and that isn't what happened. I think Wayne honestly was trying to extract as much that was good about LRY and move it into a position where it could continue to exist in some form. And I have always liked Wayne. We actually share a birthday. So I talk to him once a year on our birthday. Uh, and I have tremendous respect for him, and the position he was put in was close to impossible. And I really admire the grace with which he handled it.
So, so you're working as a taco, which I learned is not an acronym, right?
No, no.
So can you do you know where the taco thing came from? Do you have that memory?
I don't. I think it was one of those things everybody was really vague about. Like everybody knew that Susie Cream Cheese was from a Frank Zappa song. The tacos maybe were, I don't know. But we were tacos and we lived at Taco Villa. Um, and that's just who we were. And I can remember before I was a taco meeting, one of the quote unquote luminaries of LRY at a weekend conference and him saying, well, you're not an LRYer. I'm like, yeah, I am. And he's like, well, where's their office? And I was like, it's at 25 Beacon Street. And that's where the tacos work. And he's like, oh, okay. Like I passed some test because I knew those things. So yeah, we were tacos and I never, it sounded funny the first time and then I never really gave it any thought after that.
Wasn't there something about like didn't wasn't it like Joe Taco signed checks or something? Was it Taco?
Yeah, Joe Taco was this mythical figure, right? And Joe Taco ran things, but that was from that was, when you're talking about people in their late teens, the half-life of memory can be pretty short. And so this had happened like ancient history, which was probably 4 years earlier, I don't know. But there were house books. And if you really wanted to research things, you would go back through the old house books. Uh, and some of them, they were everything. People would show up and sign them like guest books. People would draw pictures. There'd be, arguments between people in the house. There'd be house meeting minutes. I mean, just everything was in these books. They were these like big artist books. And probably who Joe Taco was is in those books. But as far as I know, Joe Taco was never a real person. Just like when I started, uh, Ohio had been careful. We had a wall map of North America, and Ohio had been very carefully cut out because it had been nuked, and no one could tell me the story. Like, no, it's just like, no, Ohio isn't there anymore. It's like, okay, Ohio's not there anymore. We had lots of really active people from Ohio. I don't know where they lived because Ohio didn't exist, but that was just part of the kind of the legend that we all lived in.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. Yeah. These little trails are left behind and you just go with it.
Right. That's how things are.
Oh. Um, can you tell me a memory from a conference? You said you were part of programming, right? Or is did you do anything with helping plan conferences or even the national conference?
I was responsible for planning the board meetings. I had a role in that. But the national conferences, which were Continental Conference, which happened in the summer, were planned by a committee that was elected at the Continental Conference from the year before. So we all had to be there. I mean, had to, we really wanted to. But it was not something that our office was responsible for planning. We, uh, LRY was remarkable that way. There were adult advisors, some of whom were better than others. Some of them really shouldn't have been around young people, as I'm sure you've heard stories. But the thing that has stayed with me, and there are definitely memories I have, but what is remarkable when I look back is how much I learned in LRY that has informed my professional life going forward. So one of the things that the Con Planning Committee would have to do is find kitchen staff, and they would. And these kitchen staff were volunteers. They were LRYers, and these were people who had learned somehow how to feed 200 people 3 meals a day and do it brilliantly. And things were always late. I mean, it wasn't like perfect, but it was astonishing that all of this work was done by teenagers. And the same thing was true with the board meetings. We held those at different churches, and it was our responsibility to find a church that was willing to host us, which over the years got harder and harder and harder. I was elected at boards at Princeton, in Princeton, New Jersey, which was also where my first LRY conference was. Um, but all of that we had to figure out. And in fact, shortly after I started, we got a call at the office that People Soup, we had been doing bulk mail wrong for years, years. And the post office was finally fed up with us. And it was January. It was really, really cold. And we had to go down to this warehouse, this post office warehouse on the waterfront, which is now really fancy, but then was really just a bunch of deteriorating warehouses. And we were instructed in how to do bulk mail correctly, and we had to redo the 6,000 piece mailing. It was really cold. So, but then we knew how to do it, and we never screwed it up again. The UUA sent stuff out, but they had a mail house that took care of all that stuff. But we had to learn how to do it because we didn't have the budget for it. So I learned so much about just how things work and what you have to take into account. And really, there were adults who were useful, but I would say on balance, it wouldn't have, for the most part, it wouldn't have mattered a whole lot if they were there or not, because everything was run by us. And that was something that I was sad to see go away with YRUU. And I understand that that was sort of the sword that created all the problems in the first place, was this feeling that, we needed more oversight. But one thing I never really saw, I think got lost, was that training, that ability to learn how to do things. Because with YRUU, there were always adults who weren't just there to help, but were at some level supervising and making sure that nobody got into trouble. And so there was this period during the transition where myself and several other old LRYers kept being asked to come back and do things because YRUU wasn't training people in how to do those things. And so they wouldn't have someone who knew how to, put on a conference for 200 people, for example. And so I think that leadership training was the piece that the UUA never really saw clearly and got lost. And I think that was a huge loss.
Yeah, it's it's interesting because with interviewing people who were in YRUU, they say exactly what you just said about LRY, that they learned so much about how to do things in the world, and it went into their lives. And so I think maybe during that first initial transition, things were a little wonky, but I think it figured itself out really fast. And I hope when you see the film, I hope you'll see that even people talking that were in my era, around in the 1990s, late 1990s, were talking exactly like what you're talking about LRY was. So I hope that it evened itself out. And because it's very similar story from what you just said. And yeah, I mean, even the adults we interviewed talk about like how do you be an adult but let the youth do what they need to do. So it's I think it was still there. I don't know. Yeah, it's
I'm glad to hear that. That
yeah,
is
yeah,
great.
yeah.
The first, I don't know, at least 3 years, I think, of LRY youth staff were all LRYers. And some of that was just a function of age, but it really, there was this question about, okay, when all the LRYers age out, then what happens to this organization? Is it
Yeah.
just going to become sort of a part of the religious education programming of the UUA, or is it going to stay something that is really necessary and special? And I'm glad to hear that kernel regrew.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, of course it was different, but yeah, yeah, that was one of the first things that I kept hearing from LRYers, and I was like, I'm like, did it go away? So that was one of my mysteries. I was like, I didn't think it did, but maybe, so right. So anyways, but You'll have to tell me with some of the stories that you hear, even
Okay.
yeah, the podcast or even what we put in the documentary. Um, uh, so so I'm curious about I guess since we're talking about that transition, how did it come about that you were invited to go to Common Ground or be a part of that? What was that process like for you? Um, and were you were you working in the Taco Villa at that time? Were you still in that time period, or did you get called back after? How did it all work out? If you
Okay.
know.
So Common Ground 1 happened while I was a taco, and Taco Villa was where we lived. We actually worked in an office at the UUA. But I was a taco then. That was the Midwest summer. Um, we had boards, Con and Common Ground all in the Midwest that summer. And so we spent a real big chunk of time there. And I actually got sick and had to fly out to meet everybody, which instead of caravanning, which was ended up being a really big problem because it was the day I had to fly was the first day of the air traffic controller strike. So, I'm watching what's happening today and thinking, wow, this actually was a big part of my life. And now here we are again. But yeah, all of the tacos were expected to be there, and there were representatives from LRY from all of the districts that still had LRY, which wasn't all of them. Although, even in districts that didn't have LRY, there were individual churches that did. So those folks either were simply had been kind of isolated or they were still connected to the whole national scene, but not they didn't have a district scene. Um, so yeah, we had, I think it was Common Ground boards. I think that's how it went. And so Con was really fun. There were lots of people there. One of the things that we had to do every year was wherever we had it would, because these were big, they wouldn't fit in churches, they were outdoors, they were, tended to be camps. Um, we needed to convince a camp that a bunch of kids could sign insurance documents and contracts. The UUA wasn't doing that for us. So that was one of those things and had been an issue at Con that year. I mean, it got straightened out before we got there, but that was one of those sort of touch and go moments, I think. Uh, we were I'm sorry, Common Ground was hard. It was really hard. Um, I think it was the first because the way that adults who were anti-LRY had dealt with it, we really didn't interact with them very much. They had shut LRY out completely. And so all of a sudden, here we are at this big thing that's adults and youth, and there are adults there who think we are like Satan. Yeah. And that if they leave us alone with their children, we're going to do terrible things to them. And I don't know what those terrible things were going to be, like introduce them to music they'd never heard before, or, feed them LSD, or I don't know, but they really thought that we were just, dangerous. And it was so strange to think that. I mean, we were so used to running things that we felt like we were peers with the adults. And it was shocking to learn that they didn't see us that way, at least for me. Um, there was a conference affairs committee, which I imagine you've heard something about, which I was part of. And for me, Common Ground ended up being about the conference affairs committee. I was on the conference affairs committee. I don't know if you've heard the overt sex. That was me. And I actually heard that recording not that long ago, and to me, I sound very comfortable, but in fact, I was terrified, and I know that because I was enunciating everything very carefully. I don't ever recall speaking like that any other time. I was a kid from New York, right? We don't talk like that. But I sound like very formal and official, and it was because I was really nervous.
The Conference Affairs Committee affirms the ground rules for behavior. Okay? The drinking of alcoholic beverages, the use of illegal drugs or other controlled substances, and overt sexual behavior are strictly forbidden. And overt sexual behavior, meaning petting and intercourse in the presence of others, or that which invades the privacy of others, is prohibited. Overt sexual behavior does not include hugs, kisses, hand-holding, back rubs, eating ice cream, or general touching. To ease social tension, co-ed bedroom accommodations are prohibited, and complete abstention from petting and intercourse is requested. This is covert as well as overt. Violators of these prohibitions will be asked to leave the assembly within 24 hours and will forfeit their registration fees and any travel reimbursement. Other inappropriate or offensive behavior may result in being asked to leave the assembly. A Conference Affairs Committee consisting of 1 administrative staff person, 2 adult, and 3 youth delegates will be established to make judgments in all disciplinary matters. We expect that all delegates and staff persons will practice self-restraint and discretion in their behavior. We also expect that quiet be maintained at night and that each person will ensure that he or she gets adequate rest in order to perform the work of the assembly. That's what we'd like to see, okay? All are expected to attend the working sessions and to remain on campus throughout the duration of the gathering. Overall, we hope that we will be guided by the old maxim, in order for mutual respect to prevail, courtesy must flow in both directions.
My question is...
Okay, yes, wait, hold it. This, if your delegation has co-ed sleeping quarters, by the way, this goes for all conference members, married as well as otherwise. Okay? So, if you have any co-ed rooms in your delegation, we would request that you submit your new room arrangements to Kevin Clark by noon tomorrow. And, quiet, Lori. And that all moves be made by 2 o'clock tomorrow. Not tonight. Go to sleep.
May I have the floor?
Yeah. Quiet! Questions?
This is not a question. This is a statement. I believe that you mean what you say. I worked very hard today. This is totally ridiculous. It is absolutely bizarre to me that a conference of the UUA wants to go on record as objecting and forbidding the cohabitation, forbidding me to cohabit with my wife. You can say this, but I will not be part of a conference that does that. We were married by a lay minister of the Unitarian Universalist Church in Winnipeg.
Quiet!
We've even bought wedding rings. And just in case I'm shocking anybody, close your ears, but all of you, your parents had sexual intercourse. Believe it or not. Every time I do anything with this Unitarian Universalist outfit, they do something that insults me, and I'm getting a little bit tired of it. I worked very hard today. I am going back to my room with my wife, and tomorrow, if this ruling still stands, I'm leaving. I'm going to go to a radical place like a state park where they will let me share a tent with my wife. I really do like all of the people I've had a chance to meet here as individuals, but if this is the feeling of the group, it's stupid.
Yes?
My name is Barbara Moore. I'm the UUSC delegate at large and the LRY advisor to the Pacific Southwest District LRY board. I'd like to make several points. One, I think that this whole thing has been exaggerated to include married couples so that you'll buy it. Don't do it. Two, I would like to see the reports that each of the circle groups turned in their consensus process to the CAC stating what their feelings were on this. And unless those reports clearly state... Okay. Also, I'd like to raise the question that we've made this very co-ed and that heterosexual couples are the only people included. I'd like to know what the policy is for the lesbian and gay couples in the camp.
It is for that reason, hold it, it is for that reason that we have requested abstinence from petting and intercourse.
I would also like to state that I know that the delegation from the PSWD is cohabiting co-ed rooms, that I'm virtually positive that there's no intercourse or petting going on, but there are men and women, young men and women in those rooms. What's the difference if you allow the lesbian and gay couples to cohabitate and exclude their sexual activity from the heterosexual couples who want to, or heterosexual or co-ed people who want to cohabitate a room if they're not involved in any of sexual activity? I think this is really excessive. If this went on at General Assembly regarding all of the rumors that go about what goes on at General Assembly, we'd have to close down national events in the UUA.
I appreciate... The whole committee appreciates your concerns and your feelings about this. We spent a lot of time discussing this. We discussed all of the issues that you have brought up so far, and I'm sure all the issues that you will bring up. We were concerned with a conference that is trying to reach common ground and which wants to include everyone. And we felt that this was the best decision that we could come to in this regard. I'm sure that it would inconvenience many people. It inconveniences me. This is the first time in 2 years that I've been alone with my husband, without my child, and I am going along with this. We all felt that this was the decision that was best for the conference.
I just want to know if there's any way we can change this decision, because I think it's unfair, and I'm not sure that this conference agrees with what you guys have agreed to.
My understanding is that the only way that you couldn't change this decision is by having a new CAC, and I don't know if there's any provisions for that.
How can we go about getting a new CAC first? You would have to ask the staff that. Okay, great.
I have 2 points to make. The wording is request. I want to know if that is require or request. And
it's request.
It's request.
It's request.
Thanks. And also, along those lines, is this on faith? Or is this going to be enforced? Or attempted to be enforced? This rule. I mean, this rule, it sounds like a rule that will probably be broken. I want to know if you're going to have sergeants at arms in the rooms.
We would really prefer not to be turned into a police force, I think. The 5 of us have put a lot of time and energy into this, which could have been spent with our small groups. I personally would very much like to go back to my small group. If a police force is necessary, I suppose we would have to discuss that. But I think that to be here in the first place shows that you're mature to some degree, and that there is some trust in you to begin with. And I would love to think that we could uphold that trust.
Is there any way that we can make some kind of motion about the married couples and about the couples that are so inconvenienced? Those married couples, can we make some motion about them? Or the people that have already made room assignments that have strictly platonic relationships and it is an inconvenience for them too?
I don't think so.
I'm next. I think that if you have any questions along that you could submit them to CAC, but but not
Can't
tonight.
make a motion here about the married couples.
No. This is a decision, and you don't have anything to say in changing it tonight.
I would like to ask your indulgence and your patience and your care and your love in, first off, in listening for a second. We have no business process set up to deal in any kind of business format with decisions of the Conference Affairs Committee. So we don't know how to answer your questions about this. Secondly, it isn't as if the Conference Affairs Committee is unaware of the depth of feeling about this or unaware of both sides. And you're standing up at the microphones and making your statements is just saying stuff that they have gone over, and they've made this decision. I think that tomorrow morning, in your small groups or in this meeting, I'm not sure which, but before 2 o'clock, we're going to have to announce to you a staff decision about the way in which you can respond to this. My hunch is that probably it means the resignation of the CAC and the if you don't want to accept this, and appointing a new one, and then we'll just put another 6 people through the hell that these people have been through, and you'll come up with the same issues, and I bet you'll come up with the same decisions when you hear all the stuff that we've been through today. If you want to line up on both sides and just yell at each other the strong feelings, you could do that. I would personally prefer that all of you with the strongest feelings about this, get in a ring together and fight it out. That's the way I feel about the way the day's gone. I would like to ask that I appreciate the CAC's willingness to back off from having us do this tonight, because that's what we were going to be doing. And for the moment, you're going to bed where you are, and tomorrow we're going to try to present you with some way of dealing with this. So I would like to ask your indulgence right now to let it go and go to bed and come back tomorrow and think it over.
Wait, I think you've insulted people by this killer statement saying that we should all go and fight it out. Yeah, I'm sorry, that's...
We were not prepared for the backlash. And it was, so instead of actually being engaged in the work of Common Ground, I ended up spending 2 or 3 days of that week in meetings with the Conference Affairs Committee trying to work through this problem. And
I have a question while you're, so was there something that had happened that made this all come about, or was it just people assuming that people, how did it all,
some of the representatives from some of the more conservative churches and or districts, and as far as I know, adults only, were dismayed that there were people of opposite gender sharing rooms. And what was funny was that the Conference Affairs Committee had, this very broad rainbow of, lesbians and gay people and bisexuals and straight people. And, there may have been trans people. We weren't so versed in that at that time. But, the idea that that was the signifier of things going wrong was just sort of like, what? But there were complaints made about co-ed rooming. And that had been done on the districts had sort of decided who was going to room with who. So, I remember, for example, that the PSLRY, the Southern California district, they didn't care. And the adults didn't care. And so people just roomed with whoever they wanted to room with. It was not a big deal. And a lot of those folks, I think, were just friends. Maybe some of them were couples. But it didn't matter. But there were other places where these were big deals. And so they complained that we were setting a bad example, and, that they were. And so there was in particular one minister who was very, very vocal about all of this, and he was from Missouri, I think, and he had made it very clear that he was going to take his delegation and go home unless this, was stopped, because it was just not moral. And he was sort of a rising star in the Ministers Association. I know he was interested in joining the UUA board. So he was one of the ministers. Everybody knew who he was. And I don't think it would have been taken as a serious threat if it had been somebody who had, less clout, but it was a problem. And so we were asked to come up with a policy, and it was just this rabbit hole, because, well, for instance, not everyone there was straight. We were very clear about that. And then we got into a whole question about what is overt sexual behavior. And we talked around this for days, and we didn't really have an answer. Is it okay to hold hands? Does it matter if you're holding hands with someone with whom you have a platonic relationship? Is that then acceptable? But holding hands with a lover is not. What about kissing? At what point does kissing become overt sexual behavior? What about hugging? Just what about licking ice cream in a seductive way? That was actually one of the things that ended up in my speech. And so we knew we had lesbian and gay couples who were not married, but who would, if we said only married couples, then they would not be able to stay together at the conference, which seemed ridiculous. And so that was how we ended up with, okay, nobody, doesn't matter who you are, you don't touch anybody. There is no sexual behavior allowed at this conference, which would have been the rule at a youth conference in the district that had brought the complaint in the first place. But that didn't go over so well with the very people who had been upset about it in the first place. And I do remember so clearly the minister who stood up and showed us his wedding ring and said he was going to go to a national park where he was allowed to sleep with his wife. And it's like, okay, bye. He didn't leave. But I think by going to such an extreme, which was really our goal was not to, okay, we'll show them how stupid this is by just going so far in the other direction. That was not our goal. We simply couldn't come up with anything in the middle that seemed fair and reflective of the reality of this group of people. And, we talked about, well, what if you have minors who are married? They got their parents' consent and they're married, but they're only 17. Are they allowed to stay? It just, no matter what line we drew, there was an exception on the other side of that line. And so at the end of the day, after the conservative people who wanted the rules objected to the rules, we reversed ourselves and we agreed, and this time with the general, group, that really what we were talking about was respect, and to not do things in people's presence that makes them uncomfortable. And we could have started there. And that would have been great. And we would not have spent half the conference dealing with this pointless issue. But that's how it started.
I've learned so much through making our documentary and now launching this podcast. I'm amazed by the dedication, time, and resources it takes to bring these powerful stories to life. We couldn't do it without you. If you'd like to help us keep sharing them with the world, please visit yruu.org/donate. So again, it's yruu.org/donate. Every contribution, big or small, truly makes a difference. Thank you for being part of this journey.
I was also at Common Ground 2. I don't remember if there were still tacos then. They're the last of the tacos, which was the group that came in for like at the end of my term. And I honestly don't, I'm sure they were there. I don't remember though. My job was to write up the like daily newsletter of what had happened. So I spent most of my time in a little room, putting things together, or sitting in the back of the room listening. At that point, I was no longer, they're really my LRY peers had scattered. We'd all gone off to college, or they were already in college, and a lot of us were there, but we weren't there in the same capacity that we had been. We weren't representing something anymore. And so I had this very established role that I was happy with. And the thing that I was most unhappy as an outcome of that meeting was the age range, which, LRY had been 14 to 19, which there's a huge age difference between 14-year-olds and 19-year-olds, but it is so much smaller than 12 to 22. Like, who on earth thinks that makes sense? You have light years of differences in people's experience, maturity, and the upper end of that, I think, came out of the fact that the UUA just didn't have young adult programs. And so those of us who were coming from LRY wanted to be able to stay engaged in something. The younger end of it, to this day, I was not privy to the conversation of why it needed to be 12-year-olds. I thought it was a terrible idea. And I mean, I think, I don't know, did it eventually get narrowed? I thought so. Yeah, it just was unworkable.
Yeah, they changed it to 14 to 20, which is better.
Better, right. I mean, that's basically what LRY was. You aged out at 20, but but yeah, it was crazy. And the idea, like, all of these adults who were so worried about what teenagers were doing. It's like, okay, so you really think the 22-year-olds and 12-year-olds have that much in common? Like, who are you? And very clearly, because YRU's offices were housed within religious education, that the older end of that never really was dealt with in the context of YRUU, except to ask us to come in and do things or to be advisors at conferences. And so Julianne Silberman and I started, and by then I was actually back at the UUA. I was working in the extension department, and which was, growing the denomination, I guess, sort of evangelism. But we ran a bunch of programs for expanding physical plant and for extension ministers who were ministers that would serve congregations that weren't big enough yet to really have a full-time minister, to kind of get them to that point. And I worked in the building programs, but mostly I was bored. There just wasn't that much to do. And so Julianne and I decided, well, we clearly need to put together some young adult programming. And so she and I, with input from Colin Bird, who I was married to at the time, and a couple of other people, Eric Kamenetsky, we put together a conference in Colorado to figure out what this was going to look like. And so we created sort of the adulter, because it was still young adults, version of LRY that we all knew perfectly well how to do. I think part of it, and we heard this a lot, was that the UUA wasn't interested in spending money on young people who weren't earning enough to make contributions to the church, which was so short-sighted. I was just stunned by the idea. It's like, well, so you're just going to say bye, come back when you make $100,000 a year and now you can contribute? Why would they come back? It just didn't make any sense. So we saw this, and I was the only person that was involved in that process who was not self-identified as a UU, and most of them are ministers now. Colin's not, but he had planned to be at the time. And we knew for a fact that this was just a bad strategy, that you couldn't just sort of expect people to show up again, that you needed to have faith in them, that they wanted to remain engaged.
Yeah, the young adult community now, I think, is significantly stronger than the youth right now, and it's it's nice to see that they're still, trying to go strong and be a part of the community and the church, and yeah, that's been an interesting finding, in that, after YRUU ended, what kind of took the place of it? Nothing really.
Right.
But I see a little spark of it in the young adults.
Well, those were the young adults you were talking about,
Yeah,
who,
right,
who learned how to do in YRUU, and so they've continued that. Yeah, as I said, I'm not UU. I am a practicing Jew, and all of my friends are UU, but I don't keep, my finger on the daily pulse of things. And when I heard that with the move, they were just sort of getting rid of YRUU, I didn't understand it. It's like, okay, so you want to be the only religious denomination, maybe in the world, that doesn't actually have programming for your young people? Like, what, how smart is that? There's a lot more to it than religious education or all our lives, or, or what is it? Our whole lives now.
Our whole life, yeah.
It was about your sexuality when I was in
me
LRY.
too. Me too.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it was sort of stunning to me. It was like, okay, you guys, it doesn't even sound like you learned anything from this process. You have regressed. But they're, I guess, more interested in making sure that they are multicultural than that they have a multi-age range.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so thinking back on those moments that really taught you about how to, be in the world, how to do certain things, um, what did you end up doing in a career, as a career? How does it connect?
Well, one of the things about LRY is you learn to do a lot of different things, right? Like, I became like very well versed in Robert's Rules of Order, for example, to the point where we could manipulate them to, like get certain outcomes in meetings and stuff, which isn't what you expect from a bunch of teenagers. I have done a whole lot of different things in my life. As I said, I went back to the UUA and worked there, but that was really because I needed a job. And I worked as the receptionist for the UUA for a while, and then I got moved into the extension program, which was great. And I went to school at night. I did the first half of my college education in a more traditional way, but then went to school at night and worked at the UUA. And went to law school after that, which had been a long-term plan of mine, but not because I wanted to practice law. Lawyers run the world, and I wanted to learn how that power worked. I wanted to learn how to speak law. And I never did practice. I worked in a law firm for a short period of time, but was just sort of confirmed for myself that this was not what I wanted to do. I'm a real city kid, and I have always been fascinated by cities. And I can remember being a little kid and asking my parents, when's the city going to be done? Like, why do they keep building more? Why do they knock things down and rebuild them? Like, it made no sense to me. It's like I thought that there was a finite plan and we would get there. And if Robert Moses had had his way, I guess we would have, but he he didn't get everything he wanted. And so my primary interest was actually working in the affordable housing development world. And so actually going to law school was really good preparation for that because it's all, prior to the current administration, there were actually laws and regs about this stuff, and there was money attached to it, and there were actually things to do, unlike now. And so that was my reason for going to law school. And while I was in law school, I went and I moved to Berkeley for law school. So I was there really for personal reasons. My dad was from California, had done his undergrad work there, and I wanted to understand him better. So I wanted to go to school there. But there were lots of things about law school that weren't fun. And so when I was not having a good day, I would walk next door to the next building, Worcester Hall, which was where the city planning program was. And I would read course descriptions and sort of torture myself with what I could have been doing. I worked in affordable housing I stayed in San Francisco. I met my spouse, and he's a San Franciscan, so we were there for way longer than I had planned to be. And I still had these very strong connections in the UU world, and things were sort of set up for me to come back to New York when I finished law school and kind of like move in. The person who was the UUA board rep from New York was grooming me for her seat. And which, despite the fact that I did not identify as a Unitarian Universalist, but I had people in my corner, and that was my plan. I was going to move back to New York, where there were all kinds of interesting housing questions, and I was going to, continue to wreak havoc in the UUA, and that was going to be my life. I stayed in California and worked in the mayor's office of housing and got very, very plugged into San Francisco local politics. And so I didn't stay I was at the mayor's office for about 5 years. And then I continued to work in the affordable housing world. But I was also very deeply embedded in city hall politics. I ended up working for a public sector labor union as their policy analyst, which really was being their lobbyist in City Hall. And I ended up being appointed to the Planning Commission in San Francisco. And every city has a planning commission. In San Francisco, the Board of Supervisors, which is like their city council, they're at the top of the heap, and then comes the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission is tremendously powerful there. And so I got to be at the losing end of all of this 6-1 votes because my politics didn't necessarily line up with others. And it was a time of tremendous displacement. It was the early .com era. Neighborhoods were, being emptied out of working class people. And I cared a lot about that. So I was sort of their person, and continued to do that work while I was wrapping up my first term on the Planning Commission. The board president, the Board of Supervisors president, called me in and asked if I'd be interested in running for his seat. He was not going to run for re-election. And it had never occurred to me. I mean, despite being this person who's had these very outward-looking jobs, I'm actually incredibly introverted. The idea of campaigning sounded horrible. But he said, if you've ever thought about doing it, then you should say yes. You have my support. You will never have a better opportunity. And so I went home and talked to my family about it, and I talked to my all of my political people, and I decided to do that. And it was a horrible 6 months. It really was. My child was in kindergarten, and I basically didn't see them for 6 months unless they came out on the campaign trail with me. It was the first time that San Francisco had a ranked choice voting election. And because of that, there were all these people who wouldn't normally have run, but they figured, well, what harm could it do, right? I'll run. So we had 22 people running for this seat, and it was chaos. I was one of 3 women, which struck me as very wrong. But there we are. I came in third out of the 22. So I did well, but not well enough. And the person who was elected was someone I just honestly thought was not smart enough for the job. But he was tall, and he has this gorgeous voice, and he's handsome. And, I think that's why he got elected. And I'm small, and I'm female. And I think those things worked against me. But at that point, I was like, okay, well, what do I do now? And I'd been kind of plugged into the public health world in San Francisco because of the connections between health and the built environment. And there was an organization that was creating a new position to train public health professionals in how planning works and how urban planning works so that they could advocate for healthier environments. So I took that job. I was hired by someone who had been a year behind me at law school. It was all very incestuous. And the job itself was really interesting. And I traveled all over California and a little to the rest of the country. But what I discovered was I loved teaching. I mean, it was really, really fun. And so my relationship with my boss was deteriorating. And so I decided to apply to a PhD program in the planning school, finally at Berkeley. And essentially, as one of my advisors said, get my union card so I could teach. And so I did that. Went back to school. I loved school. It was great. I met some wonderful people. But I was a lot older than everybody else. And yeah, I was already in my 40s at that point. And so I was just in a really different life place. And socially, that often created issues, because I have to go home. I have a kid at home. And I got a teaching position that at the University of San Francisco that completely blew up in my face. It was really, really awful. And I had the dean of faculty spent most of my first year there trying to get me to resign. It was really ugly, and I made it to the end and then basically had a nervous breakdown, and I could not go back. And so I spent the second year of my 2-year contract. It was not a tenure track position. I spent the second year on sick leave, on medical leave for mental health reasons. So at least I got paid. And then I really didn't know what to do because I'd gone back to school so I could teach, but I really didn't think I could ever step into a classroom again. And at that point, I've lost track of what year it was, but it was when Standing Rock was happening, the Dakota, the pipeline. And I realized I had to be there. I wasn't sure why, but I knew I needed to be there, which is strange because I hate camping more than anything. And I was going to go to this place with very Spartan conditions. My sister-in-law also felt like she needed to be there. So we got an RV and we went together, and I just loved being there. I loved that I didn't have any decisions to make. The council was they would send word down and we would do whatever they said. And I worked in the kitchen. So suddenly, once again, like feeding now thousands of people a day, really loved it and had to go home, ironically, for Thanksgiving because we were hosting that year, or I would have stayed, but came back immediately after and was there when President Obama overturned the environmental review, refused to certify it, which was amazing. And by then I was running dinners in the main kitchen, and but still, like the elders would say, you're not serving enough meat, so we would serve more meat. It was, once again, it's like my job was to do what I was called upon to do. It wasn't, the decisions I made were like tomatoes or beans, that kind of thing. And I realized that I had this passion that I hadn't recognized for Indigenous causes. And so started spending time focusing on that, and was having a conversation unrelated to that with Julianne Silberman, who is still friends with me. One day, she, as you may know, is a chaplain, and I was telling her that I really loved being around dying people, that this was something I'd always felt passionate about, but I didn't want to be a minister, and I wasn't sure, what that would look like. And she said there is an emerging practice of end-of-life doulas, and I think it's exactly what you're looking for. And so I signed up, and 2 weeks later trained as a doula, and was very excited to do that. We moved to New York almost immediately afterwards. And so, this is the kind of work that you really need networks to get your name out there. And so suddenly I'd moved back to New York after being away for 30 years, and I didn't have that network anymore. And then COVID happened. And although COVID, you would think, would mean there was greater call for doulas, in fact, it made things much more difficult because no one was allowed to be in rooms with dying people. And eventually, when things sort of eased, I decided that I was going to do that work, but that I would do it for people who couldn't afford those services. That doulas don't make a lot of money. It's very hard to actually earn a living doing it. But that little bit of money, because it's not covered by Medicare or insurance or anybody, is out of reach of many, many people. And so that's been my focus. I do that. I work with friends, families. I worked with someone who my spouse used to play music with in Israel this summer, which was very difficult. He had 3 young kids. And I find the work hugely fulfilling. And so I do that as much as I can. A friend of mine from San Francisco, who was sort of a comrade in arms, doing advocacy work and being involved in lefty politics, runs an academic department at City College San Francisco, and finally convinced me to try teaching again. And so I teach remotely for him, and it's been really fun. And I don't have to step into a classroom because I'm 3,000 miles away. The college itself has all kinds of problems, and I don't even know if they'll be there in 5 years. But for now, I'm having a good time. The department is organizing and community development. So it's all the stuff I really care about. I'm teaching housing this semester, but next semester I'll be teaching labor history, which is another passion of mine. And because of my interest in working in Indigenous communities, which I don't have, I don't have any kind of a savior complex or anything. I'm not someone who's going to just show up and tell people what they should be doing. I ended up connecting with the Center for Jewish Nonviolence and spending time in Palestine, in the West Bank. I just got back a week ago, which is why this was so late, because I was gone for a month. This is the second year I've gone out for the olive harvest, and I love Palestine. Am I have never been a Zionist. I am, now even less of a Zionist. I'm anti-Zionist, although I am still a practicing Jew. Uh, and so I teach, I work with dying people, and I do political work around Palestine. And none of that has anything to do with the beginning of my career, but all of it is stuff I love doing. It's very immediate and hands-on. It's as I still am kind of a policy wonk, but I also really appreciate not seeing everything from 30,000 feet. It's nice to actually be spending time with people on the ground. Um, so you asked about my career. Now you know way more about it than you wanted to. But I really have done a little bit of everything.
I kind of love it because it's in some ways it's so you. You're finding your own path in life.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, so yeah.
Well, even, I belong to a Jewish renewal congregation, which my father refers to as if you blended UUism and Hasidism, you would end up with Jewish renewal. So it's, even in that context, it's a very politically focused congregation and, believes in most of the things UUs believe in. So I didn't stray. It's just, I like the ritual better.
I love it. Yeah. Well, is there anything else we missed, like from back in the day stuff, or something you'd be like, "Oh, I wish I said that."
Well, there probably will be as soon as we get off the phone. I'll think, oh, why didn't I talk about that? My very favorite intern that we had ever was 15 years old, and he was this big, tall, painfully shy guy named Hank Pierce, who had long hair and played an Irish drum. And on one night, we were still living in Dorchester, and one night a week, he would go down the street to the Irish pub and he would play drums, and they would give him a pint of Guinness and he would drink his Guinness. He'd come home, he'd call his mom, and then he'd go to bed. And then the next time I saw Hank, he'd shaved his head and he was a punk, and he was a straight edge punk, but still. And he became a minister, and he is still one of my favorite people in the entire world. But I have this sort of I knew him when feeling about him, because the Hank I met and the Hank who's out there today have very little in common except a really wonderful heart. And Hank is just one of the best people I know. And so, have you talked? Is he someone
Yeah,
you've
we
talked?
interviewed Hank. Yeah,
I figured you have to interview Hank.
Um, and I love that he sort of straightened out that everyone says that he was the one that thought of the name Why Are You You, but actually he says that it came from Bruce Southworth. So Bruce Southworth told him to present it because Bruce had to leave. But everyone always blames Hank, for it. So I don't know if you have any memories around the naming of Why Are You You or.
No, I remember that it was a real struggle. Like nobody, what do we call this? Like, well, what are we trying to say? Do we need to do focus groups? No, it wasn't that formal. But really, it was like, how do you name a new organization? And I followed some of that in the little daily newsletters. Hank was a hugely entertaining and highly disruptive presence at that meeting. He uh, I'm amazed Bruce Southworth was talking to him, because Bruce was a fairly conventional person, and Hank was just all about shock at that point in his life. And so he was talking about, like rape, kill, pillage, and burn, eat babies, and, just all sorts of things that I found very entertaining, but I could see, the people he was trying to shock were definitely shocked. But I'm not surprised that he didn't come up with Why Are You You. He had submitted some ideas, but none of them were really ready for prime time.
It's been such a thrill talking to so many people and connecting and how all these like misconnections to when we were doing the documentary. Like I know you were on our list right from the start, and it was just like it was just logistics and whatever whatever happened. And we keep saying that when we end up connecting with people, it's the right time to connect with them, and they come into this process at the right time. So we just kind of keep holding on to that. And yeah, so
wow.
Yeah, well, thanks, Lisa. You're amazing. Yeah.
I don't know if I'm amazing, but this has been a lot of fun. You did just remind me of something, though.
Good, go for it.
There was an LRYer who's quite a bit older than me named Ed Inman. He's from Mississippi, and Ed is sort of the unofficial archivist of LRY and is just a remarkable human being. And we never knew each other well, but we kind of traveled in the same circles. And about 10 years ago, maybe 15, he called me and said, Nan Warshaw's looking for you. And she had just called him. Somehow he knew how to reach me. She had lost track of me. And I called her, immediately and said, I hear you're looking for me. And what really is striking to me is that this is a network that is still that connected, that those webs have really stayed intact. And these are people who, I haven't talked to in decades. And yet, if we want to find each other, it must have been more than 15 years ago, because this was pre-Facebook for sure. It took one phone call to find somebody, which is a remarkable thing, I think, that this shared experience really bonded us all for life, even if we don't see much of each other anymore. So I think that's really the spirit of LRY.
Yeah, it's so true. I've been so grateful to the LRY Facebook group for allowing me into their group and being a part of that and getting to see the conversations and the connections that you all still have. It was really helpful for this project, and
oh, good.
So much. Yeah.
Well, Lindsay, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Lisa. I mean, this was great, and enjoy New York, and
I am.
Yeah. And keep in touch, and I'll keep in touch too. So
good. Excellent.
Okay.
Thank
All right,
you.
have a good night.
Thanks, you too.
Okay. Bye.
This podcast was produced by Linden Tree Productions. The interview was conducted by Lindsay Cattle LaPointe.
Music featured by Scott Murphy and Matt Meyer.
For more information, go to whyareyou.org. That's the question all spelled out. WHYAREYOUYOU.org.
Don't forget, our documentary, Why Are You You, is available to watch now by renting or buying it through Vimeo.
Please subscribe and review this podcast. It will really help more folks find this content.